Hello, and thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'd like to welcome to Boom and Bust the Honorable Michael Chong. He is the Conservative Party's Shadow Minister of Finance and the Member of Parliament for Wellington-Halton Hills, North Ontario. He has just taken on this new role after having been the Conservative Party's Foreign Affairs critic. Welcome to the program.
Great to be here, Tony.
Great. First thing I'd like to ask is just you're new into this role as Shadow Minister of Finance. What are your priorities?
Well, my priorities are quite simply to hammer home the message that of affordability. Life has become unaffordable for millions of Canadians and their families. And my goal is to highlight the ongoing affordability crisis with the price of gas, price of groceries, price of housing, to light a feet under the government, fire under the feet of the government to get them to do a better job on addressing this real crisis.
And do you think, let's just talk about the state of the Canadian economy right now. Obviously, as you mentioned, things are unaffordable for many, many Canadians. What else can you tell me about the Canadian economy right now?
Well, quite simply, we've had terrible GDP growth over the last year. In 3 of the last 4 quarters, the economy actually shrunk, and that comes on the heel of years of declining per capita, if not flatlining or declining per capita GDP growth for the years that the Trudeau government oversaw. And so it's not a good picture. In fact, Bloomberg recently did a survey of 28 economists at the end of June, just several weeks ago. And those 28 economists downgraded their already anemic forecasts for growth for the Canadian economy this year from 1.2% to 0.7% this year. And that's a result of the terrible first quarter growth numbers that we saw. So things aren't looking good. And when we look underneath the hood of the vehicle of the Canadian economy, things are looking even worse. It was just barely 2 years ago that the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Rogers, called our lack of productivity growth an emergency. She said, I'm paraphrasing here, but she effectively said it's time to pull the fire alarm bell and start addressing this economic emergency in the form of low, if not declining, productivity since the pandemic. And so in the last year of the Carney government, the business sector productivity growth has actually shrunk by 0.5% in the last 4 quarters. So again, when we look under the hood more deeply, the numbers aren't looking good. And the final point I'd make here is that on business investment, the numbers are equally dire. You know, for all the jet setting around the world that Mr. Carney has undertaken in the last 15 months, it's not produced the results of actually attracting investment into the Canadian economy. Statistics Canada reported at the end of May that business capital investment declined 0.7% last quarter, the 5th consecutive quarterly decline. So it's not a good picture of where the economy is going.
Yeah, one of the things I've mentioned, Michael, on my broadcast here at Boom and Bust is that I think this is from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, but there's more companies, small businesses, medium-sized enterprises that are folding in our economy right now than are being started up. So that does not augur well, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, we're seeing decline in new business formation, a decline in the number of entrepreneurs who are willing to start new businesses in this country, a decline in the number of people willing to make investments in business in this economy. And as a result, we're on the same trajectory of the previous Trudeau government under the current Carney government. And I think that's really the message that needs to get out there. The data that's coming in now for the last 5 quarters of the Carney government shows no substantive change in direction of the Canadian economy on a range of metrics.
Yeah, and I want to get into this maybe in the next segment, but basically your point is, to sum up, what I'm hearing from you is that there may be some short-term, like the job growth numbers in May, for instance, looked fairly robust. But as you say, when you look under the hood, the situation has not really improved all that much at all. And so that's what Canadians have to worry about. I want to allow our guest a full commentary, so I'm going to leave it at that until we take this commercial break. We'll be right back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with the Honourable Michael Chong. He is the Member of Parliament for Wellington-Halton Hills North, as well as the Shadow Minister of Finance for the Conservative Party. Michael, just want to unpack a little bit more what you see as the Canadian economic challenges. Economic growth, you've talked a little bit about that. Competitiveness, these are things, by the way, that were not they weren't created by Donald Trump as issues. They have been around our economy for 10 years or more. Could you just go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we've done more damage to ourselves over the last decade of the Liberal government than any damage that could be done by somebody from outside the country. Look, if you take a step back, look at the broad data, the Canadian economy has become uncompetitive. It's become overly regulated, and our tax system has become a Byzantine, arcane system that's actually misallocating capital and putting a huge burden on Canadians and Canadian businesses in compliance and administration. And finally, the fiscal framework has been chucked out the window. The previous Trudeau government constantly revised upward their deficits and their fiscal anchors, and the current government has doubled down on that approach and doubled the deficits that Chrystia Freeland had projected only just over a year ago. So the economy has become very uncompetitive, and it's shown in our broad export numbers. If you go back 25 years ago to the year 2000, about 43% of our GDP was exported to global markets, including the United States, every year. That number has dropped to roughly 1/3, a drop of about 10%. And why is that? Well, it's a combination of an economy that's become uncompetitive, that is producing goods and services that are less attractive to buyers in the Asia Pacific region and in Europe. It's an economy that the government has failed to invest in terms of public infrastructure, trade corridor infrastructure, our ports, which are ranked near the bottom of global ports in terms of their efficiency. And so we end up in this situation now where, after years of declining per capita GDP, declining affordability in Canada, we end up with a government that people had hoped is going to turn things around. Unfortunately, after 5 quarters, the numbers that are coming in aren't looking good. And I think that's because the Carney government has failed to undertake fundamental reforms to address these issues of competition and the fiscal framework and regulation and so on.
Yeah, and I do want to get to what some of the policy solutions that you and your leader, Pierre Poilievre, are in fact intent upon. But one last thing, this is a little bit out of the ordinary for me to ask this question, but I've heard this from a lot of people, not a lot of people, I should amend that, from some people, that somehow Mark Carney is he's governing like a red Tory, the term a red Tory. I have pushed back on that just by looking at his deficit numbers and other things, but I'd love to get your commentary on that. Perhaps you've heard that argument as well.
I've heard that argument. I think he's running the government of Canada more like an investment bank than anything else. He's making his international travel comes across more as a roadshow for pitching investors than anything else. His style of governing here in the country is to make a deal. It's for everything to flow through his office, whether it's MOUs with various provinces or it's announcing a deal to attract investment from outside sovereign wealth funds. Everything seems to be a deal-making process, as opposed to the job of Prime Minister, which is to oversee the machinery of government, to introduce reforms to that machinery, to introduce legislative, regulatory, and fiscal reforms that will lay the foundation for Canadians to make their own decisions and for businesses to make their own decisions about how they want to proceed. Instead, everything seems to flow through him and his office, whether it's designating projects, which he has yet to do in the national interest, or it's announcing, $70 billion of supposed money from the United Arab Emirates, which has yet to be realized. So, to me, that's no way to run the government of Canada. It's no way to run a $3 trillion economy.
We're going to be back with our guest, the Honorable Michael Chong, after this brief break for our commercial friends. We'll be back after these messages. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. My guest is the Honorable Michael Chong. He is a member of Parliament for Wellington-Halton Hills North, Ontario, but also the Shadow Minister for Finance for the official opposition. Michael, we were just getting into really, what you see as really the impediments to growth and change. You said that the Carney government really is not pushing the long-term growth or change that is necessary. I do want to talk a bit about that. You touched on it a little bit: regulatory reform, legislative reform, rather than sort of one-off deals. So if you can get into that a little bit more, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, we obviously need regulatory reform. Last June, the Prime Minister, a year ago in June, I should say, the Prime Minister was given immense powers to bypass our broken regulatory approval system for major projects through Bill C5, which gave him the enormous power to designate projects in the national interest and bypass the normal regulatory process. The Prime Minister has yet to use that authority, which is a demonstration that it's the changes that he introduced aren't working. He's also undertaking consultations for yet further regulatory reform to be introduced and yet to be announced legislation. So again, the government hasn't introduced the fundamental reforms to unstick our economy and attract both domestic and foreign investment. On competition policy, the government hasn't addressed the uncompetitive nature of major segments of the Canadian economy. We have large oligopolies operating in major parts of the Canadian economy that are shielded from foreign competition, that are shielded from other forms of competition. And that's making life more unaffordable for Canadians, whether it's in the telecom bills that they have to pay or the banking fees that they have to pay. We pay a lot higher fees in many regards than do consumers in other OECD economies. And again, the Carney government's been silent about competition reform. And then on tax reform, we haven't had major tax reform in this country in decades. It's clear that the burden of administering and complying with this system has skyrocketed. There's estimates that it could cost us annually 0.5% to 1% of GDP every year because the system has become so Byzantine. And it's resulted in a misallocation of capital in the hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in our economy, all contributing to a lack of wage growth, a lack of productivity, and a life for many Canadians that's become unaffordable and very difficult. So these are some of the measures that I would have expected from a former governor of the Bank of Canada and from the Bank of England. We haven't seen that in the last 15 months. We'll see what happens, but so far it's not looking good.
You've probably started meeting with folks, small businesses, or entrepreneurs, startup entrepreneurs, that kind of thing. What sort of feedback are you getting from them?
I'm getting from constituents on the ground in Wellington County and in Halton Region that things aren't getting better, that the affordability crisis remains, that life is as hard as it was under the previous Trudeau government. And so they're not seeing results. They're looking for results. I'm seeing in the last 3 or 4 months an increasing number of people across the country telling me that they want to see results, that they're getting increasingly more anxious for results. And so that's what I've been hearing out and about.
No, absolutely. One thing that you mentioned just now reminds me of the phrase state capitalism that you see from the People's Republic of China or from other state actors, where it's the state making decisions on investments and priorities rather than the market sector. Is that one of the things that you're worried about?
Absolutely. I think what we're seeing from the early days of the Carney government is a very state interventionist form of economic policy, a very state directed capitalism. You know, it this recent announcement about a new pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast
Hmm.
is an example of that. There's no private backer for this project. This purported this purportedly is going to be funded somehow by the government of Canada, and so that is a failure. First of all, it shows the instincts of the Carney government to have state subsidies and state directed capitalism, and on the other hand, it also demonstrates their failure to fix our broken tax system, our broken regulatory system, our broken the broken nature of the competitiveness of our economy, that we are failing to attract the private sector investors that would be willing to build this pipeline. In many other jurisdictions, they're willing
Hmm.
to put billions of dollars into a new pipeline like that, but they haven't been willing to hear.
I want to come back to that. We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back after these messages. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. My special guest is the Honorable Michael Chong. He is the MP for Wellington-Halton Hills North, Ontario, and the Shadow Minister of Finance for the official opposition. Michael, we were just talking about the pipeline and the fact that there's no private investor, and yet you mentioned just earlier than that we've kind of turned away the United Arab Emirates and said, sorry, we don't have investments for you to invest in for your $70 billion that you've committed to Canada. There's something wrong there. Like, why wouldn't the Prime Minister said, hey, we've got a pipeline to build, put your 70 billion as part of that? But
Yeah,
I don't
it
know.
flies in the face of this. It flies in the face of his promise to build at speeds not seen in generations. His lofty rhetoric about transforming, a complete transfer, the biggest transformation of the Canadian economy since the Second World War, and rhetoric and announcements like that. Clearly, it's not happening if we're turning away $70 billion in investment from the UAE because we don't have any projects ready to go ahead
Yeah.
because the government hasn't fast tracked any approvals yet. It flies in the face of this pipeline announcement. Pembina says it might invest up to 10% of the project. We'll see if that happens. But it appears that the other 90+% of the project is going to be funded by some part of the government of Canada. And then we look at things like the condo bailout that the government has proposed in British Columbia, which is a bailout for wealthy developers that have built these condos. Again, all very state interventionist and a state approach to driving the economy. And I don't think that's what's needed in this situation. Look, we tried a state interventionist approach over the last 10 years. It didn't work.
No.
And it seems like the Carney government is doubling down on the failed approach of the Trudeau government, whether it's on the state interventionist approach, the doubling of the deficits that the Trudeau government had, and other forms of economic policies.
One other topic I want to raise with you, this deadline has come and gone without a lot of commentary from the media, but we were supposed to have a deal for reducing and eliminating interprovincial trade barriers, in July 1st of this year, and no one is even talking about it anymore. Did you notice that as well?
Yeah, yeah. Again, announcements and rhetoric don't match reality. Significant interprovincial trade barriers remain the government hasn't addressed, and it's remains a problem for our economy. It's easier to do trade with countries outside of Canada than it is within amongst the 10 provinces of our federation. And again, the federal government has not focused on getting this done and making sure that we have a truly national economy. I mentioned earlier lack of trade corridor infrastructure. Again, an example of interprovincial problems in our economy is that we don't actually have. I think we're the only OECD economy without a single national highway that goes from Halifax to Vancouver. In other words, we don't actually have a 4-lane divided, limited access freeway, 2 lanes in each direction that you can drive uninterrupted from Halifax to Vancouver. The U.S. has their interstate system. The French have their autoroutes. The Germans have the Autobahn. The Brits have their M series, and the Dutch have their A series. Like in pretty much any OECD economy, you have this highway system that allows for the free movement of people and goods from coast to coast, from end to end. We don't actually have that in Canada. If you were to drive from Toronto, let's say, or Ottawa to Vancouver, the fastest way to get there is through the United States. And the routes through Canada are clogged with traffic lights, intersections, tens of thousands of impediments between those destinations. So, we're not even talking about this basic east-west trade corridor infrastructure that we need to actually create an east-west national economy.
But don't worry, we're going to have a fast train through the Alto project. So we'll see what happens there.
Which people don't realize is actually going to go from Toronto to Peterborough to Ottawa to Montreal. Yeah, so it's going to bypass the entire Toronto, Montreal corridor and all those communities from Kingston, Cobourg, Belleville, Brockville, Port Hope, and everything in between. I mean, it's just it's a ridiculous project that shouldn't even be on the drawing books.
We've got so much to talk about, Michael. I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day right now, but hope to have you back very soon. Thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching today.